There we go. It's recording. Okay, so good morning. My name is Francesca Begoli. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, the sponsor of today's program. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to our last event of the spring semester. This morning, we're hosting Professor Josh Lambert, who will discuss his new book, the Literary Mafia, Jews Publishing and Postwar American Literature, out now with Yale University Press. This investigation traces the changes in the US publishing world that transformed the field from one in which Jews were notoriously excluded to one in which by the 1960s, they played a leading role. And we're really excited to close our semester with what promises to be an illuminating presentation on many figures you are familiar with, and we'll learn much more about them from Professor Lambert. So before I introduce Josh, let me just say a couple of words about the Center for Jewish Studies. Many of you are familiar with our activities. If you're new to our events and would like to know what we have in store for next academic year, would love to hear from you. I'm going to put in the chat in just a moment the contact information. Please reach out and we'll add you to our mailing list. Also, we have a discount code for the Literary Mafia. I'm going to put that information in the chat as well. As you can see, the talk is being recorded. It will be later uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. I want to invite you to keep your mics muted during the talk. And after the talk, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. Please feel free to avail yourself of all the tools that Zoom gives us. You can type out your question if you're unable to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand and we're going to call you in the line that we receive. Professor Josh Lambert is the Sophia Moses Robison Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and English at Wellesley College. His research, writing, and teaching with together Jewish Studies and American Literary and Cultural Studies. He is the author of Unclean Lips, Obscenity, Jews and American Culture, which came out for NYU Press in 2014 and was the winner of the 2014 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award presented by the Association. Book that explores the significant role that Jewish entrepreneurs, editors, literary critics, and lawyers played in the history of obscenity and literary censorship in the US in favor of freedom of expression. Its new book that is going to present today, The Literary Mafia, likewise explores an area in which Jewishness shaped the direction of modern and contemporary life in the US. And Professor Lambert is also currently at work on a new narrative history of Jews and Jewishness in the US, in US literature and culture that centers the perspectives of women, LGBTQ people, and people of color. So, Josh, I am thrilled to welcome you to the Center for Jewish Studies at the GC. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Begoli, for inviting me to do this. Thanks for everyone for coming. I'm really always, very happy to have an opportunity to share my research. Zoom is this strange thing that we've all gotten used to. Please do, don't hesitate to throw comments into the chat. I'll try not to let them distract me too much as I give a talk, but I hope to wrap up, fairly, with plenty of time so that we can have a real discussion. Because I'll say for this book, and I hope this will come out as I speak about it, the piece of it that's most compelling to me, frankly, is as a conversation starter to have people think in more critical ways about the networks and systems that their own work, their own writing is part of. So I really welcome. Usually, sometimes after a talk we say, we really want comments. We really want questions and not comments. But I actually don't mind often at the end of a talk on this book, like hearing some stories. I think that can be really interesting. What I thought I would do, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some of the material that I gathered and put together as part of this book. Hopefully that's going to work okay. And where I thought I would start actually is something that I haven't done in a talk about this book before, which is its reception. The book has been out for almost a year now. And the reception has been quite an exciting ride for me. Not exactly surprising, but in a way, I think useful for illustrating some of what's at stake in the work that I do and the way that I think about it. So I put on the screen two short excerpts of reviews that the book has gotten so far. And what's striking about them is not just how they disagree, I suppose, or the different ways they make me feel, but the ways in which they illustrate the two-sided nature of this topic and the intensity that people bring to it. The first review, uh, somewhat to my surprise, because I thought maybe that I would not quite get something quite as intense as this, compares the book quite sincerely to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, if you don't know what that is, it's probably one of the most famous and pernicious sources of anti-Semitic discourse in the modern world. It's something that we have to take incredibly seriously. That is as powerful a force for evil and violence against Jews as almost anything we can think of. The second one is a review that starts out that says the book, The Literary Mafia, is a brave book. And that's also interesting to me because, frankly, I don't think of the work that I do as in any way brave. I think that one doesn't necessarily become a literary scholar out of real courage. And I think that, I really think about the work that I do as being generated from a place of curiosity, of interest, of excitement, many other things. But I think that the degree to which it's possible to understand this work as somehow either perverse or evil, or on the other hand, as morally good and emanating from that place, is sort of fascinating and cuts to the heart of what's difficult about the subject. So I'll try to give examples from the framing of the work of why I think this kind of review originates. The thinking I did, the place where I started thinking about this book, was just making the realization, which I think anyone who spends a lot of time thinking about Jews and their history, and also spends a lot of time thinking about 20th century American culture, is likely to come to, which is that Jews were very much involved in the founding of and the leading of major American publishing houses. And what I put on the screen now are just the logos or colophons of some of the major and minor American publishing houses that were founded by Jewish families. And these range from something like Random House, which is one of, if not the largest publishing house in the world, to smaller and really important innovative presses like the Feminist Press or FC2. And these were founded at different moments. Some were founded like Knopf, which is in the upper left, in 1915, whereas FC2 and the Feminist Press were founded in the 60s or 70s. So it spans a great range of time, and and it's just interesting as a fact to state, and I don't think it's a fact that anyone could argue, that these houses were founded by Jewish people. And the question that I wanted to ask in writing this book is does that matter? How does it matter? Why does it even, what can we say about it? And I do what we always do as scholars when you have a question like that, and you look at the histories. And I went and read wonderful, extensive histories of publishing in America that talk about the foundation of all these houses and many more, and that talk about the ins and outs of the industry. And this stuff just doesn't get mentioned very much. And that's a pattern that was very familiar to me from my work on obscenity and pornography, where I would look at defendants and judges and lawyers and publishers, and I would see that a lot of Jewish people were very invested in a particular discourse, and I would see that in the history of that field it wouldn't get mentioned. Obviously, one of the groups that does love to talk about this idea of Jews having power in the publishing world is anti-Semites. One of the things that I could not have predicted to happen during the period of my book's release is that we'd have a major American celebrity recirculating ideas of Jewish media power and control as let's say, influentially as the rapper Ye, also known as Kanye West, did sort of a few months into my book's release. So we had like a few really interesting moments of anti-Semitic discourse around Jewish media power that came out. And I always like to mention, because it is complicated and not unrelated to some of the things you could say about my book, is that a lot of my thinking about this book did really start many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, on a neo-Nazi website, which I never linked to or cite because I don't want to support that kind of site. But a really thorough, really detailed accounting by neo-Nazis for very bad reasons of Jewish success in the publishing industry. And I thought, looking at that page, that it was something that I could take seriously and think about. Obviously, it's not just anti-Semites who think about this question of Jews in publishing. We also get much more mainstream figures. In the book, I talk about writers, famous, well-known American writers like Jack Kerouac and Catherine Ann Porter. And this is maybe the most notorious example of someone who could not shut up about it, which is Truman Capote. I gave you on screen a little screenshot of what it looked like when he said this to Playboy magazine, when he talked about the Jewish literary mafia. And the one of the other things that I really like to emphasize when I talk about this is it's not just, let's say, avowed anti-Semites and people that we might think of as sort of semi-avowed. I don't know what you say about Jack Kerouac or Truman Capote. They're complicated cases. I don't know that we can so easily call them anti-Semites, but people with anti-Semitic ideas. But it's not just them who spread ideas like this. The other example that I always bring is, I love this article from Publishers Weekly, which is the industry magazine of the publishing industry. And this is an article from the 1970s in which a serious person who works in publishing estimates that up to 70% of all buyers of hardcover books and quality paperbacks in the United States is Jewish. And I once, for a conference panel, I did like the math on the back of a napkin of what this would mean. And I think the result was that, like, for this to be true, each Jewish person of any age, like from babies to elderly people, would have to buy 5,000 books a year or something like that. It's like a totally impossible, mathematical, ridiculous statement, but it comes from an essentialist claim about Jews' intellectualism, Jews' literacy, Jews' love of books, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do intelligent, reasonable, sophisticated people tend to deal with this problem? What they like to do is not talk about it. So, by the way, before I get to that, I'll go through this quickly. This is an example of how the slide in front of you is an example of how kind of intelligent, smart people who are Jewish and who are thoughtful about this stuff end up using the same discourses as the anti-Semitic people. So this is an ad from the New York Times that the Jewish novelist Meyer Levin took out. And this is Richard Kostellanitz's The End of Intelligent Writing, which is the most extensive. It's about 400 or 500 pages of very thorough, thoroughly researched, thoroughly cited sort of claims about Jewish literary power in the United States. But what do sophisticated, intelligent people tend to do on this question? They tend to sort of pretend it doesn't exist, and they try to not talk about it. So this is in 2013. I asked the fiction editor, still the fiction editor of the New Yorker, Deborah Treisman. So how do you think about stuff like ethnic solidarity? Do you ever, since you're from a partly Jewish background, and David Remnick, who edits the magazine, is from a Jewish background, does that ever affect the kind of stories you choose? And the answer is, in much more eloquent and sophisticated than I'll paraphrase it, no, we don't think about it. We just pick the best stuff. And that's totally reasonable, and it's totally what I would expect any thoughtful person who works in the publishing industry to say. But I can't really believe it. And I can't really believe it because I've read the work of sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu and the sociologists of taste who work in the tradition of Pierre Bourdieu, and any sort of thoughtful, quantitative study of taste that you can find by anyone who's spent time or gotten research money to do it will tell you that taste is not a magical, disconnected, isolated thing that just exists magically, that comes up magically out of nowhere. Taste is linked to gender and class and race and background and geography and region and all sorts of, and sexuality and, every other age, every other quality of a person can be, and often very in a very sort of straightforward way, linked to the cultural tastes they manifest. So it doesn't make sense to say that, oh, I just sit here in my chair and pick the best material to publish, because of course your positionality, who you are, what your experiences have been, have to play a role in the taste that feels natural to you. So what do you do what do you do with this? How can we study this? What I try to do as a scholar, and this is the same method that I used in my book on obscenity, is follow the advice of the intellectual historian David Hollinger, who talks about the question of how we study minority influence in a larger culture. And what he advises us to do, and what I try to do, is to keep in mind, quote, the internal diversity of ethno-racial groups and the contingent, historically specific character of the culture these communities present to the larger society at any given moment, end quote. So what that means in short is that because you know someone is Jewish, that doesn't mean you can predict how they'll feel, how they'll act, what they'll like, how they'll think. But there might be some historically and demographically specific, historically contingent patterns that appear in Jewish people's behaviors or tastes that we could study in a particular moment, place, and time. I use that approach to think about the issue of Jews in the American publishing industry. And what I try to do is, in very grounded, historically contingent, historically specific ways, tell the stories of and make explanations of how Jewish influence and power in the publishing industry would have mattered. What happened when Jews overcame significant anti-Semitism and rose to influential positions in American literary culture? What choices did they make? How did it affect what got published? How does it affect the shape of American literature? And obviously that's an enormous project, and in many ways it's too large for any one book to take on. And what I try to do in the Literary Mafia is, present a whole number of cases and group them in ways that make sense to me. And what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk, for the next maybe 20 more minutes, is try to give a couple of examples of what I found in the book and what made sense to me. And the way that it makes sense for me to do this is to talk about two editors at the publishing company Knopf, both because it's one of the most interesting, famous, prestigious publishing companies, and because just how different these two editors were in how their Jewishness played out in their editorial choices. So I'll just say, Knopf, I won't say much about Knopf as a company, although it's really fascinating. It was founded in 1915 by a Jewish family, by Alfred Knopf, his wife Blanche Knopf, and his father Samuel Knopf. So it was like a real family that worked together as the leaders of this firm and raised the money for it and developed it. And they were all Jewish from different, sort of relatively different backgrounds. And it's been around for more than 100 years now. It was famously bought by Random House in the 60s, but it maintains its editorial independence. And one of the reasons it's fun to talk about is that if you meet an author, I think actually, like, even if you meet an academic who has dreams of publishing a trade book, but certainly if you meet a poet or a novelist and you ask them, name the top 3 places where you'd be most excited to publish your book, still Knopf would be at the top of many of those lists. Okay, so the two editors I'm going to talk about, the first is an editor who rarely appears in any history of anything. He gets maybe one sentence in most histories of Knopf, less than that in general histories of American publishing. His name was Harold Strauss, and he was the editor-in-chief of Knopf from 1942 to 1966. That seems like a fairly big deal to me. There's very little written about him, and he didn't leave an oral history that I've been able to find. So I've put together as much as I could biographically about him, but not that much. I know he was born in 1907. He went to the Horace Mann School, which is in New York, a well-known school, and then he went to Harvard as an undergrad. And then he just got a bunch of jobs in publishing, and he was hired at a few other publishing houses, and then he was hired at Knopf in the late 1930s and rose to be editor-in-chief. What I could find to learn about him was book reviews that he wrote. It was incredible that he published so prolifically as a book reviewer, mostly before he started to work at Knopf, but even after, that I could get a real sense of his literary tastes from just the book reviews that he published. I'll tell you that in 1934 alone, he published 23 book reviews in the New York Times. That's, almost one every 2 weeks. It's kind of incredible. And what I'll say that I learned about his taste is, Harold Strauss's taste, is that he really liked European literature and translation. He reviewed German, French, Italian, Norwegian, and Spanish literature in translation. And he also liked Anglo-American modernism, particularly William Faulkner and James Joyce. He did review a lot of Jewish literature, including books by Stefan Zweig, Arnold Zweig, Meyer Levin, Arthur Koestler, Albert Halper, and Hillel Bernstein. And he seems to me like particularly interested in Jewish work that drew on folk materials, told the story of sort of European Jewish culture. For instance, let me see what my next slide is. No, this is already getting ahead. But in a he was reviewing a translation of Yudjid Singer's Yosha Kalb, which is a great Yiddish novel, in 1933. And he says what he likes about it is that it, quote, illuminates the folk ways of a people. And he says, quote, it is impossible in a brief space to indicate how burdened is this book with the long and tragic history of the Jews. So that's the kind of thing that Harold Strauss liked. I won't go into it too much because I want to move quickly, but the other sense I get of him in his reviews is that he is careful about the idea of Jewishness as determining a Jew's position nationally. So there's this example I found of him reviewing a book by the German writer Jakob Wassermann, where he talks about how, Wassermann is really upset by being a German and a Jew and sort of figuring out his identity between Germanness and Jewishness. And what Strauss says about that is basically like, that's his problem. A lot of us here in America don't have that conflict. We can be both American and Jewish, and it's not an issue for us. And the reason that those tastes are interesting to me is that one of the things that Harold Strauss and Knopf under his direction should get credit for is being an extraordinary publisher of Yiddish literature and translation. Really, the signal house in America, the leading house for publishing Yiddish literature. And what's on screen now are the title pages from a bunch of Knopf translations of important Yiddish literature. They had a huge success with I.J. Singer's The Brothers Ashkenazi in the 1930s. It was a huge bestseller, and they followed it very quickly with a whole bunch of other I.J. Singer books. But they also published other Yiddish writers in translation. On the screen now is Maurice Samuel's anthology of work by Yud Lamed Peretz, and also the first book in English by the future Nobel Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer. What I learned by looking at all these books and thinking about, why was Knopf so influential or such a leader in publishing Yiddish literature and translation, is that they positioned Yiddish literature as a part of the great works of European literature. So for instance, on what I have on screen now is a little blurb of how they marketed an I.J. Singer book by saying it can be compared with Tolstoy's War and Peace without condescension. And the other example, I think I have one more example of, this is from inside one of these Yiddish books, and the way they presented it is great novels from many tongues, and they have a book by Thomas Mann and a Norwegian book and a French book and a Russian book. And of course, within that context, there's some American literature, but Yiddish literature fits right in. So Yiddish literature worked for Harold Strauss because it sort of could be represented as great works of European literature. What fascinated me was that obviously there was plenty of American Yiddish writing happening at this time, and Knopf had absolutely no interest in that. And not only not in American Yiddish writing, but even in American Jewish writing generally, Knopf had very, very little interest in publishing. And I was able to find, looking through the Knopf archives at the Ransom Center in Texas, the ways that the editors talked about it, and explanations for why they weren't interested in American Jewish writing. So this is from an incident that happened in the early 50s where Knopf got pitched an anthology of work from Commentary Magazine, the great American Jewish magazine, that was basically bits from commentary that had appeared as under the heading Commentary and the American Scene, or from the American Scene. So these would be like little slice of life pieces of like what it's like to be a Jew in Kentucky, or like what it's like to be a Jewish garbage collector in California, whatever, just like little bits of, Jewish Americana stuff. And what's fascinating is that the project, the first person to respond to the project, what's on the screen now, and I know it's a little hard to see, is by a non-Jewish employee of Knopf who worked in the publicity department named Bill Cole. And he's basically very excited about the project, thinks it's going to be amazing. He says it's going to be a fascinating book, warm and amusing. And he ends this little report by saying it should be of great interest to all Jews, to intelligent and inquiring Gentiles, and perhaps even to the Goy Polloi. And if that joke doesn't land for you, I'll explain it later, but I always like to share it. So he thought this book would be great, but Harold Strauss, this editor that I'm talking about, is absolutely not so sure and does not think that it's particularly going to work. He says explicitly here, quote, "The Jewish market has become quite a good one, but only when a book coincides with one of the major Jewish emotional orientations. For example, the establishment of the State of Israel, the extermination of the Jews of Central Europe, or clinical studies of and attacks on the causes of anti-Semitism." So here is an editor saying there are three kinds of Jewish books we can sell: books on Israel, books on the Holocaust, and books on anti-Semitism, and that's it. This book about Jewish life in America does not fit in to any of those things. And he goes on to say it has strong nostalgic value for some of us, but it treats the Jews as separate communities in America, and many Jews are unwilling to think of themselves in that way. So that gets back to that point that I was making, right? Harold Strauss didn't want to think of himself as a person whose Jewishness denied him his full Americanness. And he thought that this kind of book, of this kind of material from commentary, just didn't sit right. So I think, I'm moving sort of quickly with it, but the picture you get of Strauss is someone who saw Jewishness as rooted in European traditions, as connected to European prestige and high art. And that's sort of the kind of books that he wanted to publish. And frankly, I'm very grateful to him, because what it means is that we have all these amazing translations of Yiddish novels that were made available and spread really throughout the US and throughout the world. And so that's sort of fascinating. Okay, so now I'm going to very quickly go on to another example, a very, very different Knopf employee who worked at a very different time. This is Gordon Lish, who worked at Knopf starting in the 1970s and until the late 1980s. And what's on screen right now is something that Cynthia Ozick wrote to him, which is Lish would call himself Captain Fiction because he loved to publish fiction. Cynthia Ozick said, no, that's not right. You're Saint Fiction, Tzadik Lish, der Knopfer Rebbe, which is like it's great. He's such a fascinating, hilarious character. There's so much I could tell you about Lish, and we could talk about, argue about. But I want to really just focus on what kind of Jewish work he published and what he didn't. In terms of his biography, we have much more. He was born in 1934. He grew up on Long Island. He went to Phillips Academy, a fancy boarding school, and got expelled for fighting. He worked as a radio DJ. He got married. He bounced around. He ended up in Arizona and then in California, where he fell in at the late tail end of like the beat poetry movement and was friends with some of those people. He came into his life as an editor mostly through small magazines. He had a magazine called Genesis West, which is fascinating, out in California. And then he talked his way into a job. It's really astonishing. He just sort of out of the blue said, I want to be the fiction editor of Esquire magazine. And somehow they let him do that. And his feeling was, that was a very waspy space where the people in control were old school, sort of prestigious, Yale and Harvard educated Protestants, people like George Plimpton and Reed Whittemore. And I'm going to play for you, if you'll indulge me, a little bit of one of my phone interviews with Lish, where he tells a story about, I think the way he explained it to me is this is like his first day in the office. And what you'll hear my question and you'll hear his answer. Hopefully this will be audible to you. I'm wondering if you felt in your life, like, or in your editorial life, were you perceived as Jewish? When you came to work at a place, at Esquire or whatever, do you feel like people looked around and felt you as a Jewish person?
Without question. And this was accentuated or asseverated, I think would be the word, by Rust Hills, who at the time occupied a desk out in the hallway just outside my office, which was hardly big enough to accommodate two fellows, something of an exaggeration. When he shouted into me, in the midst of my cutting down the enormous lot of slush and agented stuff that had come in and that hadn't been attended to, did I wish to reply to Louis Auchincloss, who was on the line wanting to know what nationality I was.
Okay.
That's a direct quote.
What do you think that? What did you take that to mean?
I replied, "You're shitting me," and I couldn't hear what Hill said to that, and I simply then closed the door of my office.
Okay, so I know that's not the most audible. It was obviously a phone call that I recorded. He's sitting in the office, and Louis Auchincloss, who's like the paradigmatic American WASP novelist, genteel novelist, is on the phone and wants to know what nationality you are. And obviously this is Lish's sense is he's being asked, "Are you Jewish?" And by the way, his name is Lish. It was changed from Lishinsky, from a name that was maybe would have been more obviously Jewish. I'm wondering. Hold on, let me go to the next slide if I can. Okay, so here's an example of what I found in Lish's papers of how Jewishness might have been at stake. This is soon after he gets to Esquire. A big thing at Esquire is to publish excerpts of forthcoming novels. And so they get sent a little bit of a Wallace Markfield novel. Wallace Markfield is a sort of comic Jewish novelist. And the first paragraph you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the first paragraph is Lish saying, "I've already told you how much I like this. I think it's great. Respecting the density of the Yiddish and the extent to which it limits the audience, lots could be brought into English without damaging the total effect." So Lish is saying, like, yeah, this is fun. It's a great excerpt of a novel. We can do it. And if you feel like there's too many Yiddish words, we can do something about it. He gets a response. This is an inter-office memo. He gets a response from Don Erickson, who's his boss, basically, who says, "I can see as many reasons for doing it as not doing it. As for the latter, one major one might be that, God damn it, it's time now the Jews stopped yammering on in this way." And I actually had seen this before I talked to Lish, and I said, like, do you think he was joking? Because, sometimes people joke around, and at least in Lish's memory, it was like, no, this was totally serious. This was a sincere comment that, like, Jews need to stop yammering on in this way. I'm gonna skip, just to make sure we have time. But like a lot of what I talked to Lish about and asked him directly was, were you explicitly looking for Jewish writers? And in short, the answer was yes. He said, I would see a Jewish name and I would read and I would try to find excuses to keep reading. I wanted to. Lish is the last thing. Lish is shy. He cares about this stuff and he wanted to publish Jewish writers. And one of the effects of this that I think is incredible and hasn't been appreciated in the way that people write about Lish is he was absolutely responsible for giving Cynthia Ozick, one of the most important Jewish writers of the 20th century by any metric, a much wider audience. This is from a little letter that she sent to him with one of her stories where she said, "I wrote this story, I looked at it, I saw it cannot possibly be for Esquire because it is too long and too Jewish." And of course, Lish somehow finds a way to publish it in Esquire, which, still then, like today, is like, it's a magazine of like cheesecake photography and like, stereo reviews and like what the heck, like Cynthia Ozick's story, which is about, medieval Jewish writers and their relationship to like classic Jewish texts is like doing in that magazine is just incredible. And it wasn't just Cynthia Ozick, it was also Grace Paley, writers like Harold Broadkey, Harold Bloom, Leonard Michaels, Stanley Elkin, that Lish both published and also taught their work. And really, because of his influence over a whole generation of teachers of creative writing, he sort of helped to create an alternative canon of writers who still get read to this day because of Lish's influence. There's many more examples I could give. I could do this at much greater length. But this next example that's on the screen is from Ozick. Had an essay in Esquire in just after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which is an incredible and incendiary essay that I don't think has been reprinted, or maybe was reprinted. The title of it is "All of the World Wants the Jews Dead," and it was her sense that in the Yom Kippur War that there was just a sense of like anti-Semitism on all sides. Lish, in sending this to his non-Jewish colleagues at Esquire, says, I will hear quarrels against some of the prose here and there, blah, 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 but that is about all. She is saying something I feel, every Jew really feels, is undeniably true. And of course, Lish can't speak for every Jew, but what he can do is speak for himself. And what he's saying here is his own feelings, his own passions, his own beliefs. He's using that as the justification for publishing Ozick's work. Part of why Lish is doing, publishing this work is interesting is that he published a lot. He's famous for publishing Raymond Carver. He published a lot of Southern writers like Barry Hannah. He published all sorts of interesting stuff, but he didn't publish everything. No editor does. And part of the contrast I want to develop for you between Lish and Strauss, who worked at the same company a few decades apart, is that Lish said explicitly he had no interest in publishing work in translation, and he basically never did it. He did not publish European literature. He did not see that as part of his mission. And I think that to the extent that like we have a vision of Harold Strauss publishing, when he used his prerogative to publish Jewish literature, he would publish it as a European phenomenon connected to European high art writing. What Lish would do is he would publish American Jewish writers, often whose language and prose styles were inflected by Yiddish, but in a sort of complex and avant-garde kind of way. If you think of like the prose of Grace Paley, I think that's an excellent example. And I think that it's important, it's crucial, it's necessary to understand these editors and what they accomplished. It's important to think of their Jewish background and how it influenced them. But of course, it doesn't mean that it influenced them in the same way, right? There's no way in which we could say that the result was the same. It was actually almost diametrically opposed. But I think that to not talk about it is a true loss. I'm going to do my last example very, very quickly so we can leave room for questions and answers. But one of the cases that I love to talk about, and I'll just do it very quickly, is the National Book Awards. Because I truly think, and I really believe this, that the National Book Awards, which are founded in about 1950 and become one of the most prestigious American literary prizes, are really responsible for our sense that Jewish writers were so prominent in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Jews won the prize so many times in those years that it really made the statement that Jews are at the center of the national literary conversation. And I, of course, was interested to think to myself, were Jews also the judges of those prizes, and were they responsible for giving all those prizes to Jewish writers? And is that one way of thinking about this claim of like Jewish influence in the field? And so I looked through. Long story short, I found one year in which there was a majority of Jewish judges on the prize. It was for 1953, and there were 5 judges. There was Martha Foley, who was the non-Jewish editor of Story magazine, a Harvard professor named Howard Mumford Jones, who was not Jewish, and then 3 young Jewish intellectuals who are on the screen right now, Alfred Kazin, Irving Howe, and Saul Bellow. They had all sorts of books to choose from. These are all the finalists that they could have chosen, like big books, Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, And fascinating to me, this really interesting Jewish novel that no one ever talks about called The Landsman by Peter Martin, which has maybe the worst title of any Jewish novel ever published because it is a mistake, right? The plural word for Landsmann in Yiddish is Landsleit, so it's like totally nonsensical. But if you can get past that, it's like a pretty good novel of Eastern European Jewish life. But of course, they didn't pick any of these novels on the screen. The book that they picked is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is, one of the most, by some arguments, the most important African American novel of the 20th century. And of course, personal relationships played out in this. Like, a bunch of those judges were personal friends. Kazin and Bello were like good buddies of Ellison's. I do think it's really important to think of Jewish influence and power having operated in this case. But of course, the result wasn't necessarily the selection of a mediocre Jewish novel. It was the selection of a novel that these Jewish intellectuals felt reflected their own experiences, their own desires in a way that maybe is not totally predictable, or at least wouldn't be predictable in the simplest kind of analysis. I will, I'll wrap up there saying, part of what compelled me about doing this work is that telling the stories of what gets published and what doesn't get published seems increasingly important. And I don't think, like, if there's a lot of academics listening to me right now in this room, I don't think that I have to convince you of that. We all know that networks of power, which include systems of injustice, like, influence who gets published, who doesn't get published, and the careers that people have. I think if there are poets or novelists in the room, they'll have stories too. They'll know about how what's going well, how many people of acting in good faith, wanting to do good work and to promote justice are doing excellent work in the publishing world, and also how many battles are left to fight in towards more equity, more justice in these fields. And I don't think we can get to a better place in any of these systems without being very critical of them, very aware of them, aware of how power works. And I think that's the job of us, as those of us who are historians, to look through the archives, to look through the places where we have evidence we can use, not to make sort of bold trans-historical claims about how power works. And I think, like, what I would want to insist on is that I don't do that in this book or anywhere in my work. I really resist that. But I don't think we can be afraid to look at the evidence that we have and make strong arguments for how power and systems of influence affected what we get to read and what we get to think. I think I can leave it there, and I hope we'll have plenty of time for a conversation. I will stop sharing my screen, of course, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Josh. This was very thought-provoking and so rich. I have a number of questions, and if people have questions too, please feel free to either type out your question or use the hand raise function on Zoom, or if you can show your video, you can just raise your hand and we'll take you in the order. But if it's okay, I'm just going to start with a question. I was very struck by so many things, but one of the elements that stood out is, of course, the important role that editors have as cultural arbiters and shapers of the cultural field. And so the snippet that you showed when the editor is saying there are three things that American Jews want to read, or that the public in general wants to read, right? It's about Israel, it's about Holocaust, it's about anti-Semitism. And I'm curious, in your work, particularly when it comes to Gordon Lish and other editors that were working with American Jewish authors rather than publishing translations from Yiddish, were you able to detect certain themes that have influenced American Jewish culture through the choices that these editors picked?
Absolutely. What's interesting with Lish is it's less a theme and it's more aesthetics. With Lish, what matters less is what you're writing about. And a lot of the writers that he publishes it's actually a little tricky to say what they're writing about. And it's more what the sentence looks like. So the Jewish writers that Lish wants to publish, and I would say, if the most recognizable ones maybe are Ozick and Paley. If you think about them, really it's on the level of sentence level syntax that you can look at almost a single sentence from Paley or a single sentence from Ozick, and you can identify that it's them, and you can identify that it's not conventional English. And I think that's what is most interesting to Lish and Jewish writers, is the way in which Hebrew and Yiddish and maybe Russian and Polish, other languages, come into their prose and affect the way that the sentences work. But that's just one example, right? And I really do think that editorial taste is pretty much individual, or you can group beyond that. So another example that I didn't mention, but I do talk about in the book, that I think is likewise very very important to think about, is Pat Knopf, who is the son of Alfred and Blanche Knopf, who famously, it was a very big deal, left Knopf in 1959 to start a new publishing house called Athenaeum. And he joined up with a guy named Mike Bessie, who was a big editor, also Jewish, a big editor at Harper, and they started this new big, very important company. And they did a lot of interesting things at Athenaeum, some of which was very similar to what Knopf had been doing. But the thing they did that was new and that was absolutely path-breaking is Hebrew literature and translation. They were the first big major press to do big books of Hebrew literature and translation. And fascinatingly, like Yoram Kaniuk, the Israeli novelist, his first book was published in English by Athenaeum before it was published in Hebrew. And, again, that openness and that sort of curiosity about what the new Hebrew writing would look like in the 50s and 60s was really present at Athenaeum with Pat Knopf and Mike Bessie in a way that I don't see any other editor picking up on in America for another 10 or 15 years after that. So I think we have these cases where the particular very specific tastes actually have huge consequences for what gets read and developed. So that's another example. You asked particularly about American Jewish writers, and I think that there are probably other examples, but I'm not sure that there's one that comes to mind that's as simple or clear as those examples. I think those are just so clear that they're helpful to talk about. Whereas often it can be a little harder to put your finger on.
Yeah, thank you. While we're waiting for questions from the audience, I had another one, if I may, since you led your presentation starting with reviews and how reviewers picked on a particular element of the book, which was expressing the role that many Jewish editors and critics had in the field, and comparing, drawing connections with the theme of the book and anti-Semitic claims. And you explained to us how sort of the seed for some of the themes in the book came from that neo-Nazi side. So I'm curious if you were concerned by the end of the project that the theme of the book may play into anti-Semitic tropes, and if you've had any sense that this could happen. I ask this question because I know that, for instance, in the field of Jewish economic history, there's a very similar concern that scholarly work may end up in the wrong hands and be distorted. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of it is that I had the experience with the book about obscenity and pornography so clearly that it has become a sort of familiar. This has been familiar, for a long time now. Even before, at the very beginning of that project, which really was my dissertation. So I lived with it for such a long time. I had this sense that, oh yeah, the moment this comes out, it'll get picked up by white supremacist neo-Nazi websites, and it did. And I'll say that, that book came out in 2013 and 2014, and very soon after it came out, there were those kind of exploitative, sort of superficial or pernicious readings that sort of scrape it for what's useful for anti-Semitic discourse. And there was, for instance, like David Duke, the white supremacist figure, one of the most prominent white supremacist figures in the country, tweeted about that book about obscenity and pornography. And in 2014, when that happened, David Duke didn't feel like a particularly threatening presence in American culture. But I'll say that when he retweeted it in 2017, I felt much, much, much sicker about it, and it's profoundly disturbing. I think the short answer, the simple thing I can say, and I hope it's true of everyone working in economic history, which I think is such an important and fascinating field, is that we can't let those people determine what work we do. I think any serious reader, any thoughtful reader, I mean, look, no, what I was about to say was easier to say, frankly, a few years ago, because it's gotten even worse since then. What I would have said a couple of years ago, even in 2019, 2020, I think I would have said any serious, thoughtful reader of goodwill, whether in the academy or outside of it, will see the care that's being taken and will understand that this is the context in which it's being done, and will understand that what I'm trying to do is, what we're all trying to do is write history, cultural history, other forms of history in a way that's responsible and thoughtful and understands, is true to what happened. That said, I think like the first review I showed and other reviews that I've gotten on this book actually come from within the Jewish community and suggest that people are no longer, don't necessarily want to read in that way, attentive to the thoughtfulness or carefulness or context. And I think that I'm not super judgmental about it in the sense like it's upsetting to me, but I get why someone would read that way. If you lost a loved one in a act of mass violence against Jews in the United States in the last few years, which is quite possible, I can understand that you can't be dispassionate about the potential of anti-Semitic discourse. I feel heartbroken by that fact that there are people alive and reading my work today who will say a white supremacist killed my family, killed a member of my family, and they read websites that recycled these kind of claims and scraped them from serious scholarship. So this is, it feels impossible to live in this world and do this work, and yet, I mean, what else are we going to do? We have to keep doing the work, and we have to, I think apologetics, fear of talking about subjects because we can't, we like pretending that these subjects don't exist cedes the field entirely to bad actors. So I don't think that's a solution either. And I think we have to just keep going, being as careful as we can, as thoughtful as we can, and as open about the problem, like not to let the problem itself be off the table. So I think that like we have to be talking and supporting one another more as we do this work, because I know that people who write, I mean, I'll give just one other story. I don't know if it makes you feel better, but it made me feel better. I heard we hosted at Wellesley a talk by David Kurtzer, from the historian at Brown, who writes about the relationship of the Catholic Church to the Jews. And he, has a big new book based on the opening of the Vatican archives about Pius XII and, what happened during the Holocaust. And, as he describes it, he's been denounced in the Vatican's own newspaper, by people, who are writing on behalf of this massive worldwide institution, who are denouncing his work. And I just feel like, of course, that topic is so crucially important, and we can't sort of understand the world we live in if David's not going into the archives there and learning about that. And yet I think that the problem is a very significant one.
Yeah. So there was a question in the chat from Tamara Holt that I think is referring to this conversation. She's asking, how is this addressing your critics, such as the Richard K piece you showed earlier? I'm not sure if Amara would like to maybe expand on the question. Please feel free to do that in the chat. Or if your answer to my question may have already addressed. Perhaps we can come back to it. There's another question by Sarah Robbins. Do you think that the editorial taste brought forth by Jewish editors or any other minority editor is being diminished by how dependent we are on the final metrics for acquisition today, comp sales, author platform, etc.?
I think that's, I mean, it's really interesting to think about. And I would defer, and I would, want to hear from people in the industry who really work with the most current, sort of ways that people are working. My instinct or my sense, and again, maybe this is wrong or maybe it's not fair, is that a lot of those metrics are applied in ways to get, okay, how to say this? Back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, what an editor says when they want to acquire a book is not, I love this, it pleases my taste, so let's publish it. What they say is, my sense of the market is that this book will do very well in the market. Now, that's a projection that they're making, and it's we know for a fact in the 40s and 50s that they really didn't have much data that they were using to like actually determine the market. Now, I know that some of the cultural producers in the world we live in are very algorithmically based and are probably very, very quantitatively, like statistically grounded in how they use stuff. In the literary publishing industry, I think when people are using comp sales, talking about platforms, they're often doing it to bolster the taste that they already feel. In other words, so they'll find, I think an editor will find a way to find evidence to justify a choice, quite often using that data as support rather than being hemmed in by it. But again, like that's my sense from the outside. I've certainly interviewed lots of agents and editors and things like that, but I can't speak for those people, and I'd want to hear that.
There's another question by Yannis Siligakis that directly addresses this issue. Is asking whether there are ways for the publishing industry, or at least the fiction, I assume, publishing industry, to work in an anonymized way. Submissions of manuscripts and the editorial correspondence to be anonymous, so as to avoid cultivating rumors of favoritism or disfavoritism.
I really appreciate that question. It's my favorite kind of question, which is answered in a long endnote in the book that no one's going to read. So there is an endnote on exactly this, but precisely on people who use anonymity as their way of avoiding nepotism. And this was actually like quite popular. I think it peaked really around like 2010 is my sense in American literary publishing, where they do magazines and journals would say, we're going to have an anonymous reading system, and that's the way we're going to avoid nepotism. I don't buy it, and I think that there have been excellent published critiques of that approach, right? Because what you do when you anonymize is you just you kick the can down the road on some level, or you obscure the degree to which your tastes are determining what you choose, right? If you want as an editorial board to so in other words, your tastes as an editor. So if you get a pile of things of submissions and you choose without any knowledge of who the people are, what you'll be doing is choosing just based on the non-explicit sources of taste that align you with writers in that pile. if you would like to have diversity, if you'd like to publish people from particular backgrounds, you need to use biographical information. And I don't think there's any reason not to. I think for me, the advice I'd give to any editor is just be forthright about what you want to accomplish and accomplish that, right? If you want to publish work by a certain group of people or that accomplishes something, say that in your materials, make clear that that's your project, and then go ahead and do that in the best way that you can. I think anonymity is like a false, it actually doesn't work effectively in a sort of logistical way. And as some writers, I forget who the writer I quoted says, it's basically anonymity and saying that we just pick the best stuff in an anonymous pile is just racism by proxy or something like that.
Yeah, on that question, where I come from, the entrance exams to the university are anonymized, and they say that this is the way to actually remove any bias. However, there were rumors that were circulating for quite a few years that, for example, like Masons, you know Masonry, right? That Masons used to do distinctive marks so they can become visible. So, for example, the story was like you can do 3 dots, and then you would signify to another Mason to treat you favorably. So what I'm saying, I mean, I agree with you that you can anonymize, but I think human beings will find ways to circumvent that. So I agree with you. We should err on the side of being forward and being candid, and if somebody like discriminates you, fine. I mean, that's the process towards becoming better.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right that question of anonymity, it actually ties very quickly into an issue that's a big issue in Jewish history in the US right now, which is about affirmative action and college admissions. And whether, for some people, they would say the solution is we should know nothing about the candidates and just judge based on their scores. But I think many people would argue that actually isn't a way to create a more just or reasonable system. And it's a long political debate that we don't need to have here, but I think it's connected.
I see a hand up from Matthew Johnson, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks. It's also I've been enjoying the book a lot. I was excited in the talk that you emphasize Yiddish quite a bit, and the role of this kind of network that you're tracing in the publishing of Yiddish literature and translation in the United States. And I just wanted to ask, I mean, many of the examples you cited are not surprising examples. Like, you have like Peretz and like you did Singer and like Bashevis. And I was just wondering if you have like, were there, cases of Yiddish literature and translation, or even of Hebrew literature and translation that were surprising to you, that were kind of outside of this core canon? Or is it in some part that like it's not surprising because publishers not made them so central also in the American imaginary, and so like my sense of what's surprising is also, or not surprising, is deeply shaped unknowingly by these editors who haven't received much attention. But I just like how is this shaped like the role of Yiddish in the United States? I guess it's like the larger question.
Thank you. And I think because of the nature of my book, we have to disclose that we're co-editors at Journal. So that's very important to say. No, I thank you. And I think that like my instinct is toward the end of what you were saying. I think it's going to be very easy 10, 20 years from now to say that what's surprising is that no one published a single thing by Miriam Karpilov, and no one published the fiction of Anna Margolin, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's precisely like what matters about this work, is that our whole sense of like what the core of something is has to do with who makes those choices. And to say more about Strauss and that, right, there's something interesting for us to talk about in Yiddish literary studies about how the center of the field really was imitative of European high modernism, European naturalism, and I don't think I don't think that's a surprise. That scholars have been working on that, but I don't think we necessarily center or attend enough to the fact that that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the sort of known canon of Yiddish American or 20th century Yiddish writing, and that there are many other ways that could have that we could think about it, and we could think about what the center is. And as was mentioned in the introduction, like what I'm trying to do in the next book, which I'm really just starting on and really don't know what to do, is to ask the question of like, what if we just write it, if we shape the canon in the exact opposite way, and you just start from the other place, then what comes out is the particularities of how, and I guess that's what I'm trying to do when I talk about Strauss. I'm trying to like paint him as a person with very particular tastes. Like, it's very unusual. I think if we met an editor today who said like, I'm an editor in America and all I want to do is publish stuff that kind of looks like Eastern European writing, like that would be fine, but it would be interesting. You would want to talk about it. You wouldn't talk about that person as like, oh, just publishing whatever is interesting to them. You'd say like, that's such a specific mission. And I think that's important to me. But I will say like, yeah, there isn't a lot in that particular, in the Yiddish stuff. I wouldn't say that there's much that's like surprisingly particular. Lish's writers are like weird, right? When you think about English Jewish writers in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it's Roth, Bellow, Malamud, etc. But his list is like Ozick, Paley, Harold Bloom, Harold Brodkey, Stanley Elkin, and really that was his own like very special strand of things. And also the Hebrew stuff is weird, right? Yoram Kaniuk as like the center of 20th century Hebrew writing, I don't think makes sense to most people. So that also seems very particular.
So just to go back to Tamara Holt's question from before, I think she seems to be pushing you to address your critics more directly, or those reviews, which I don't think were critical because they called you brave, and I'm sure they praised the book, but to address those reviewers more directly.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard. Thank you for the question. I think it's a little hard to do that. And I'm wondering why. No, I don't know. If I don't know a reviewer well, the nature of my method is that to understand what someone has written, I want to know a lot about where they're from, what else they've written, what context they're writing out of. And I think particularly to understand how a critic is thinking about anti-Semitism and Jewish pride and Jewish complexity in this moment in 2022, 2023, there's a lot I want to know about them. There's a lot of questions I'd want to ask, and those aren't questions I'm going to get about those particular reviewers. It feels wrong to do it. I would like have to interview them and say, how has your life been touched by anti-Semitism? How do you think about your own privilege and the structures of power that your Judaism have connected you to? And I think that when we write about this period, 50 years from now, 30 years from now, we'll want to know the answers to those kinds of questions. And I'll say, as maybe the best way I can market my book, if you haven't picked it up yet, is the acknowledgement section is something like 8 pages long. And it talks a lot about where I come from and how I got to publish a book with Yale University Press, and how that happened and who helped me and who didn't. Because I think that I want to give the tools to other people to think through that stuff, to understand that this work doesn't come out of a vacuum and it doesn't just appear. And I couldn't have written this book if people didn't give me research money to go to archives. I couldn't have published this book if people didn't do me favors. So again, Brett Kaplan, who wrote the one that called it Brave, I know her a little bit. I've met her once or twice. I could probably ask her some questions, and I could make some assumptions and guesses about the ways in which her background might lead her to think that way about the book. But I don't know Richard Kay at all, and I don't know that he'd welcome hanging out with me. I think it would really take though asking those kinds of questions. This is, if anything, if like the book wants to push something, it's that in the world we live in, especially online, it's very easy to see someone's take on something and say, here's my response to their take. Here they said this, and thus I'm going to respond this way. And I try with my students, with my colleagues, with people out in the world, with like people I know in my personal life, that if they say something wild or intense or hateful, even, I want to try to think about where they're coming from, what might make them feel, and say that. So I don't know that I can like give you what you want in terms of response to the critics, but that's what I take away from the fact that the book has elicited those kinds of reactions.
There's a comment from Miriam Segal. She, I think, had to leave the meeting. And she is remarking on the fact that the person who valorized Ozick and valorized Kanyuk, right, that the same person valorized both makes so much sense to me. But was it the same person? Was it Lish that, no?
No, it actually wasn't. I mean, it's around the same time, but I don't know that there's that much connection there. But I do think thinking of those two writers as linked at this, just thinking about, another way is not, we don't have to think only about one editor as the key sort of lens onto writers, but to think about moments and what's happening at that part. I do think Kaniuk and Ozick are getting published in America at exactly the same time and in some similar ways. So I think that is pretty interesting.
Miriam is just joining back again. Miriam, did you wanna? We were discussing your comment. If you want to jump in and expand on it.
I am curious for you to say more about what you see connected between those two writers.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it didn't seem worthy of an out loud comment, but just I was so struck by that connection that I didn't know about. I mean, I guess, I started reading kind of Hebrew literature on my own at a later age. So it's not that I was reading Ozick and Kanyuk at the same time, but just I never thought about them actively together, but the kind of sort of intensity and that. So I'm just you making up my terminology as I go, because I've never articulated this to myself even, but just the intensity of Ozick's kind of language, and also not exactly fantasy. I mean, right, there's not that fantasy means certain things to us now within literature, but these kind of building of other worlds that are obviously in our universe of reality, like the principles of our reality. They're not science fiction, they're not fantasy in that sense, but in that other sense, but creating these other worlds, and just that combination of intensity of language. You can't read these things as you're looking, you can't listen to these on audiobook. I think I've never tried, but that I enjoy immensely. And like that, I grew up knowing that Ozick was not exactly center of the canon. And even among the American Jewish writers, I was like, oh, she's like more on the edge than Philip Roth or Saul Bellow, right? And then it's kind of similar to Kanyuk, like he's a really important writer, but he's not canonized in the same way. And just like, so that I encountered as kind of like, I wonder why, because I didn't always already know it. And I guess that's it. I mean, the reaction is simply, kind of aesthetic and recollection of my own reading experience of these two. And it makes, I already was interested, just from what you said in the beginning or the middle part of the talk about Lish, but perhaps this is narcissistic, but it makes him more interesting to me, even that he had this particular reaction. I didn't know of that connection to Ozick, that he had that reaction to her writing as, whoa, this is something different and special. I realized I'm putting words into his mouth, but and that he recognized Kanyuk, which I would think would be harder for him to do, because
so that's the
sending him
clarification.
letters.
Lish wasn't supporting Kanyuk. That was Pat Knopf at Athenaeum and Mike Bessie. So it's not exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I conflated those two.
No, but I think the connection that's interesting is that I do also share with you that sense of like, oh yeah, they both have, maybe the word I'd use like height. There's like a sense of heightened language and heightened plot or scenario.
Not holding back their intellectual aesthetic personalities like that were clearly kind of outsized. Is that fair to your experience?
Yeah, no, I share that. And what I'd say is, even if it's not the same editor, because I think Lish would not have been interested in work and translate. Like, he wouldn't have felt like he could get the work.
Right, of course. So Lish was the editor, brought Ozick into and who was the one again who sort of noticed?
So it's these publishers at Athenaeum, which was a new company,
right? That broke off from Knopf, or that the people came from.
And the thing is, Mike Bessy, like, what one of the novels that Mike Bessy was incredibly successful with, like, one of his great achievements was Andre Schwartzbart's Le Dernier du Juste, The Last of the Just.
Yeah.
And precisely the nature of that book, which Bessy talked about, was like, it was a novel in French written by a non-native French speaker who like was layering Hebrew and Yiddish. And he was like that as Mike Bessy was like he was into French stuff, and he was like that, and was also Jewish, and like connected all that stuff together. So like you might make like interesting connections there between that and Kaniok, but also I just think Kaniok, like, we have to think of him in this weird moment in America, like in the late 50s, early 60s, late 60s was the moment in which like his work started to
I had no idea that he was brought into English then. Yeah.
And I don't know if you've read his memoir. I haven't read all his work, but he has this memoir, fictionalized memoir called, in English, Life on Sandpaper, where it's him driving around the American West, like hanging out with people. It's like so wild and wonderful.
No, I have not read his memoir.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Thanks for this, Josh.
No, it's fun to talk about. Good to see you.
Really interesting. Yeah.
We have one other question from Sarah Robbins. Perhaps we can close on this. Are you seeing or tracking any patterns and cultural shifts in Jewish fiction and nonfiction that's published today by trade publishers?
Yes, in short. It's not so much in this book. In this book, the last chapter is about nepotism, and how one of the things that I noticed in the last, let's say now 30 years, is that so many of the most successful younger Jewish writers are the children of other successful Jewish writers. And I talk about that a lot in a chapter of the book. But I do have a piece in the Cambridge History of Jewish American Literature that's on the period from 2000 to the present. And there I trace a few sort of major trends. And in short, one of the trends is a kind of the larger lens of the trends that I use there is institutionalization. One is that much more than in the 1950s, American literature is produced in the context of the university. And what that means is that it becomes quote unquote research. So what you see is a lot more long citational lists of the books that were consulted for this novel or even poetry collection, and all these references and all these translations and all these other things that scholars do are much more regularly done. So that was one thing. Nonprofit foundation funding is a big part of it, that a lot more Jewish literature is being produced because someone had a fellowship and then had a second fellowship and then got sent on a trip by someone. So if you think of major American Jewish works of the 20th century, a lot of them are funded by and inspired by major sort of philanthropic things. And there was one other trend at the end of that article, and I forget what it was. But I mean, internationalism, globalism is another big part of the trend. There's a lot more it's pretty hard to think of a major work of American Jewish literature from the last 20-ish years that's not very much invested in cross-linguistic and international kind of movements of people and ideas. So that's a big part of it. But there's a lot of work to be done in that field, and there's a lot more to talk about. And I'm happy to share any of my work there. And I'm also sure that I'm missing a lot of trends that are happening. So thank you all for listening, for being here, for your attention. If you have questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking in this format, obviously you can find me online and follow up with me. And just thank you again, Francesca, for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to share my work.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh. You gave us a lot of food for thought in such a sophisticated and nuanced way. So I really want to thank you from all of us. We're reaching the end of our program. So thank you all for coming. Oh, Yanis is asking, what's your preferred email?
I'll put it in the chat, and it is really, if you just put Wellesley and my name into Google, you will find me, but it is this one, which is wonderful, strange.
So thank you all. Thank you again, Josh.
Thanks.
Have a great rest of the
enjoy,
day.
hopefully a sunny day.